happened before, but I'm going to change the scripture reading this morning. I'm going to be reading not from Psalm 14, but from Psalm 19. So if you already turned to Psalm 14, just turn over a few pages. If you're using a Pew Bible, it's on page 433. Before we do, let's ask God's blessing. Dear Lord, as we open our Bibles and we open our hearts, we pray that you would speak to us this morning. Speak to us of your presence, of your will, and of your way in our hearts and in our lives. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. I'm going to be reading from Psalm 19. I'm going to be reading verses 1 through 4. In Psalm 19, the psalmist says, "The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There's no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. Yet their voice goes through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In the heavens he has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom from his canopy, and like a strong man runs its course with joy." I also want to read just a few verses from the first chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans. Romans chapter 1, Paul is talking about God, and he's talking about those who observe God or those who don't observe the presence of God. And he says in verse 19, "What can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So they are without excuse." May the Lord bless to us this reading of his holy word. We are, I guess you'd say, in the midst, although we're still kind of at the front end, of our Explore God series. And in this series, we're going to be tackling some pretty difficult questions. Some of the biggest questions, I think, that people have about faith and about God. This morning, we're going to look at what's probably one of the most fundamental of all those questions, and that is the question, does God even exist? Is there anyone out there who created the world and all that's in it? Is there anyone out there who will hear my prayers, who will help me make sense of it all? Is there anyone out there who loves me and is concerned for my well-being? These are some big-time questions, and they all begin with that fundamental question, is there really a God? Is there really anyone out there? Now, I realize that most of us are here this morning have already, at least in some sense, begun to answer that question. We have a particular bias. I'm going to assume that most of the folks who are here this morning believe that God exists. Now, I'm not going to say that everyone believes that, because I don't presume to know everyone who is here. But I think that most of us are here in the first place because we think God does exist. We're here to worship God, to learn more about God and about our place in the universe and our place in God's kingdom. So, if we already believe in God, what's the point of addressing this question at all? Why even go there? Well, I think there is a good reason for covering this topic, even if we already believe in God, and here's why. In the first place, if you say that you believe in God, I have to tell you, I don't really believe you. At least not, I don't believe you 100% of the time. I don't believe you 24/7. Because I don't think anybody believes all the way, all the time. At least nobody in my experience believes that way. I think we're all a little bit like the man in Mark chapter 9 who came to Jesus asking Jesus to heal his son. And Jesus told the man that everything is possible for those who believe, for those who have faith. And the man responded to Jesus by saying, "Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief." I think we're all a little bit like that. We're all a mixed bag of belief and non-belief. Sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. But don't worry, that's okay. Jesus didn't condemn him and send him away. Jesus healed his son. Tim Keller, in his book, Reason for God, says, "Faith without doubts is like a human body with no antibodies in it. People who blithely go through life too busy or indifferent to ask hard questions about why they believe as they do will find themselves defenseless against either the experience of tragedy or the probing questions of a smart skeptic." So you see, even believers should think about why they believe. We should do it for others. First of all, the Apostle Peter, who denied Christ 3 times, said, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." We should be able to respond with genuine answers for those who have questions. We should have good reason for our faith. But we should also do it for ourselves. All of us will one day face tragedy and suffering. It's an inevitable part of human life. And where do we go to find God in the midst of all that suffering? Those who have thought about these issues will weather those storms much better than those who wait until they're in the midst of the storm to start building their shelter. Reflecting on why we believe in God provides comfort in the midst of tragedy and meaning when sorrow strikes. You notice that in the wake of national tragedy like the shooting at Sandy Hook or the bombing at the Boston Marathon, even the secular media doesn't call on secular sources like Richard Dawkins and ask why this happens. They call on pastors and on religious leaders to help them understand the pain and sorrow of those events. And by the way, that would be the next question we consider. Why does God allow pain and suffering? We're all looking for answers on that difficult question. But back to the question at hand. How can we know that God exists? Well, it's one of those things that philosophers and theologians have attempted to answer this question for centuries. If you're looking for an airtight, ironclad proof that God is out there, I hate to disappoint you, but you will not hear one this morning. Quite frankly, I don't think there is one. If there were, somebody a lot smarter than me would have thought of it a long time ago, and we would all believe in God because somebody had proven it. Now, first of all, I don't think that it's something that can be proven, at least not definitively. And I think that for 2 reasons. First of all, I think that there's a reason that God requires an element of faith in our relationship, in our religious experience. I think faith and trust are a part of any personal human relationship. And if we're going to have a personal relationship with God, and that's basically what I consider religion to be, then we are to have some kind of element of faith and trust present in that relationship. So faith is a part of our relationship with God. Now, from a philosophical standpoint, if we're considering the existence of God and looking for some kind of proof, we have to recognize that our perspective is limited. You see, we can only go on and look at physical evidence because we're physical creatures. And we have physical organs like eyes, ears, and the sense of touch to perceive the world around us. All we can perceive and process is physical evidence. And if God exists at all, God is almost by definition not a physical entity. God does not exist in the physical universe the same way that we do. And if that's true, how can we ever hope to perceive God with our senses or even with our minds? God is far beyond our perceptions. Now, having said that, let me also say that we may not be able to confront or even detect God directly, but we can know that God is there by other evidences that we have of God's presence. C.S. Lewis said that he believes in God. He said, "As I believe in the sun, and that the sun has risen, not only because I can see it, but because by it I can see everything else." So if we're looking for evidences of the existence of God, if we're looking for some kind of proof for the existence of God, what evidences can we see? What fingerprints are there of God on the creation and on the universe? Proofs for the existence of God generally fall into two categories. There's the logical category and the existential category. Logical proofs have pretty much been in existence for centuries, and they're much the same as they ever were. The argument is essentially that of David in Psalm 19, who said, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim God's handiwork, and day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge." The first logical argument for the existence of God is what philosophers call the teleological argument, and it states that because of all of the intricacies of the universe, from the course of the planets in the skies to the detail of biological and atomic minutiae, all of these things point to a great designer. The argument is simply much like the person who was walking along a trail in the woods, and they looked down and there on the ground saw something shiny and pick it up, and it's a watch. It's still running, it's got gears, it's got numbers on it, it's got hands, and when they saw that watch, and as you look at that watch, you immediately assume that it's something that someone has dropped, that someone has made, that it has come to be here because someone was there before you. Now, it's also true that all of the elements in that watch, all of the metal, all of the sand, the crystal, all of the parts of that watch exist in the ground. They could have come together of their own accord, or by some accident, or by some flood that washed all of those metals and all of those particles together in just such a way as to create a watch. But it's not very likely, is it? And so, when we see something as intricate and detailed and obviously made as a watch, we assume there had to have been a watchmaker. We assume that there was a designer. We assume that all of these things didn't come together all by themselves. And that's essentially what the argument is, that when we see all the details of life around us, when we see all the evidences of design, then we must assume that there's a designer. Now, I could use a lot of different examples. There are many in nature, but let me use just one. Most scientists today agree that the universe began some 15 billion years ago with an amazing flash of light and energy in which all matter and all the laws that govern it were created instantaneously. Scientists obviously call that the Big Bang. Now, while you might think the Big Bang would negate an argument against, or be a negative argument against God, in reality, it is one of the greatest arguments for the existence of God. Because think of it this way. How did whatever exploded in the Big Bang get there in the first place? Francis Collins, the author of The Language of God, put it this way. He said, "I cannot imagine how nature, in this case the universe, could have created itself. And the very fact that the universe had a beginning implies that someone was able to begin it. And it seems to me that that had to be outside of nature." My son, who was at one time was a philosophy major at UNT, likes to say it like this. He said, "In the beginning there was nothing, and then it exploded." Even a celebrated physicist like Stephen Hawking concludes, the odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. I think there are clearly religious implications. Get that? From Stephen Hawking, there are religious implications. That means God. There are, of course, lots of other evidences, like the anthropomorphic principle, which states that the universe was made in exactly the right way to support life. And even the most minute changes, in some cases just a millionth of a percentage difference, would not have allowed the universe, or perhaps in some cases even matter, to exist in the way that we see it today. And so life as we know and see it would not exist. And there are many more arguments like that. Those are the teleological arguments. There are also arguments of folks like Thomas Aquinas, who claim that there is no such thing as an infinite chain of events. For example, if we see motion in the world, Newton's laws of motion remind us that there must have been some beginning to that motion. Therefore, we could understand God as the first mover or the first cause in a long chain of events that ultimately resulted in us thinking about such things. This is called the cosmological argument, and it states that everything that exists, or ever did exist, is either dependent, meaning it was caused by something else, or self-existent, that it was not created or caused by something else. And not everything in the world can be dependent. Many things are dependent on something else, but there has to be an end of the chain at some point. There has to be a first mover or a first cause, and that particular thing we call God. Now, I should mention that these proofs do not say that the unmoved mover is necessarily the God of the Bible. These are general proofs and not specific proofs. But there are also other reasons for believing in the existence of God. And there is a category in philosophy that's called epistemology, which is a fancy way of saying how you know what you know. And this is a very big deal in philosophy because sometimes you can make grand statements about what you think might be true, but those things turn out to be completely unprovable. And so you have to be clear about what you know to be true and how you know it. Is it something that you've discovered by logic? Or is it something that you have perceived through your senses? How do you know what you know? William James was a philosopher at the turn of the century who developed a system that he calls pragmatism, which defines truth as that which is useful to the person who believes it. He said that all we think and all we know is really just what we perceive. All we have to deal with is neurological data interpreted by our brain. Think of it like this. Our senses, our eyes, our ears, all that input is going through electrical currents into our central processing unit. And all that we perceive is the way in which we process that information. For example, how do we really know that we're even awake? Perhaps we're really just asleep, dreaming that we are awake. Or perhaps none of you really exist at all. You're just part of my dream, and I'm really not even a human being. I'm a dog asleep on the hearth, dreaming that I'm a man and that you're all part of my dream. You couldn't disprove that because all of our perceptions would lead us to believe otherwise. Now, William James said that it's not practical to think that way. I mean, what would be the point? So he said, instead, we act as if all that we perceive is an accurate representation of the world around us. We might, in fact, be a dog asleep on the hearth, dreaming that we're a human being, but it's not practical to believe that. So instead, we go through life acting as if our senses give us a true perception of the world around us. But, in fact, we may have taken the blue pill and are now a part of the Matrix, the artificial computer construct. And the point about that movie was you can't tell the difference between one construct and the other. Our brains can't tell the difference between that and reality. Yeah, that takes you a while to get your head around that one, doesn't it? Well, my point is simply that it's important to think about how we know what we know. And that what we experience in life is just as important as logic. Some people say they believe in God because they felt God's presence, or that God has somehow moved and worked in their lives. How can you argue with that? You can't. You may say that, oh, well, that's just a false sense of security, or a warm feeling, or it might even be indigestion that you feel. But you'll never convince someone who believes that God has touched them that God is not. Their experience is real and true to them. I once had a seminary professor who said that if you ask somebody what they believe, they'll give you all kinds of Bible facts and doctrines. But if you ask them why they believe, they will always tell you a story. They'll say something like, when my mother died, I didn't know how I would cope. I didn't know how I would be able to get through it. But I felt a warm presence inside me, loving me and assuring me that everything would be all right. Or they might say, I was sick with pneumonia or cancer or lupus or pick some other debilitating disease. And God came to me and helped me through that. I know it was God who healed me. They will always tell you a story if you ask them why they believe. His point was that there's always a personal connection which is the final and ultimate assurance of the existence of God. It's not just logical. If it was just logical, we would present a logical argument, hand it to somebody, and say, well, there you go, now you believe in God. But you can't argue somebody into the kingdom. And yet, that logical component is part of why we believe. Tim Keller, the pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City, says that it's kind of like a three-legged stool. We do believe partly because of logic. We like to think that what we believe is reasonable, that it makes sense. And in his book, as I mentioned, The Reason for God, he says it actually makes more sense than not believing in God once you're presented with the evidence. But he says we also believe because we have a personal connection, because God has touched us in some way. And Keller says that we also believe partly for social reasons. We share beliefs with those who are around us because they're important to us and their beliefs help us with ours. It would be awfully hard, for example, to be the only Buddhist in a family of Pentecostals or the only Christian in a family of Muslims. Our beliefs are supported by those around us. So these are all evidences. These are all ways that we can think about the existence of God. And they're helpful to us in the same way that evidence, for example, is helpful at a trial. It's not the same as certainty. It's not the same as the judgment, but it is evidence that leads to the judgment. Even, for example, at a trial when you have eyewitnesses, if you have multiple ones, they may not always agree. What you have ultimately are hints, fingerprints on the universe that God is there. Evidence is not the same as truth, but it points the way to truth. Sometimes people like to refer to God as the man upstairs. There was a man in my church in Texas that always, I don't think I ever heard him say God. I always heard him say the man upstairs, as if you could go into the attic and find God. I think it was C.S. Lewis who observed that looking for physical evidence for God was a bit like Hamlet going up into the attic of his castle looking for Shakespeare. He was looking for the one who made it. If there really is a creator, if there's a writer of our story, he wouldn't be a part of our story, but would be outside it altogether. And that's what we find in our lives. God, if God can be known, God is truly apart from nature and the world as we know it. But if God is to be known, God can only be known because he has written himself, if you will, into the planet. And that's exactly what God has done in Jesus Christ. And here's where the rubber meets the road. If God truly does exist, and I believe that the evidence is stronger in favor of God than it is against God, then what difference does that make in your life? If you believe, will you continue to be the same as before? Or will that knowledge make a difference in your life? Imagine a scenario like the little puppet this morning. You are desperately in love, and one particular person has captured all your attention and imagination. Like the little puppet Zachary, you can't stop thinking about her, the way she walks, the way she talks. You think about her all day long, at home, at work, and traveling in between. And then one day, your friend comes to you and casually mentions, "Hey, I saw Betty today," and suddenly your heart beats faster and faster. They have mentioned her name, and you try to remain calm. And your friend says, "You know what? She kind of likes you, and she told me that she would like to get to know you better." Oh, happy day! Your wildest dreams and aspirations are now fulfilled. You can die happy. Right? No. If you found out that someone you love also loved you, it's not enough just to know that. You would want to go to that person. You would want to start a relationship with that person. You'd want to talk to that person and have them talk to you. You would take action. I believe the same is true in our relationship with God, with our faith with God. We know that God exists. We believe that God is out there. I haven't proved it this morning, but we know, don't we? We have evidence and we have experience of the presence of God in our lives. God has written himself into the story of the world. God loves us. Now, what will you do with that knowledge? When you know somebody loves you, you go to them. You talk to them. You spend time with them. Let me encourage you this morning to spend time with the one who loves you. Let's pray together. Gracious God, we know that you're out there. We know you hear our prayers. We know you love us. And I pray that you would receive us as we speak with you, as we walk and talk with you along the way in our lives. Amen.
Please stand and join me in singing verse 1 of number 298, "There's a Whiteness in God's Mercy."